Did you know that in the Generation 1 Pokemon games, if you go into a gym, face one of these statues, then pull out your fishing rod, it will actually let you fish? This is from an oversight with the tile that the statue is placed on. But did you know that you could also use cut to cut grass in Generation 1? This appears in some future generations as well, but whenever I mention this in a video, people in the comments always say they have no idea that you could do this. Now, while you could spend your time cutting grass in Generation 2 as well, you could also go to the Safari Zone. Well, actually you can't, but there does exist a map in the game files for Gold and Silver suggesting that a Safari Zone was at least planned, but never actually implemented. Another secret in the Gen 2 games that you can do pretty easily while playing through the game normally is turn off the surveillance cameras in the Team Rocket headquarters under the sketchy shop in Mahogany Town. All you have to do is walk up to the scientist, defeat him in battle, then go to his computer and turn off the cameras. This will allow you to go through the rest of the headquarters without those annoying cameras seeing you and sending Team Rocket grunts after you to battle. As for Generation 3, Pokemon Ruby and Pokemon Sapphire introduced a new move in Icicle Spear. There's just one problem though. No Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire can actually learn Icicle Spear, and you can't even obtain the TM for it. Despite this, there is still an animation for the move in Ruby and Sapphire, which you can only obtain legitimately if you trade over a Pokemon from Fire Red or Leaf Green, which released about a year and a half later, as in that game, Pokemon can learn Icicle Spear. Another unused secret element in Ruby and Sapphire is this. Unused sprites for your character doing a wheelie off the front wheels of your bike. I don't know why you would ever need to do a wheelie off the front of your bike when you can do them on your back wheels as well, but it was at least planned sometime in development. For something you can actually access in the game though, there's the Scorched Slab. It's a cave on Route 120 that serves no important purpose despite having a unique name. You can get the TM for Sunny Day here, and it's said that this cave is modeled after Ama no Iwado, a mythological Japanese cave where the sun goddess Amaterasu shut herself in. This could just be a fun Easter egg, but given the specific history, it makes me wonder if more was ever planned for the Scorched Slab. It did plan ahead a bit in Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, however, as we move on to the 4th generation of Pokemon, with this gift Tentacool you could get. A gift Tentacool doesn't sound all that interesting since Tentacool can be found pretty much everywhere in the Johto region's waters, but this specific Tentacool wasn't even known to exist when the game first came out. In order to get this Tentacool, you have to be in Cianwood City and have no Pokemon with the moves Fly or Surf, and no Pokemon that can learn them. If you talk to this person in the Pokemon Center, they will then give you a level 15 Tentacool, so you can then use Surf to get out of the town, as otherwise you would be soft-locked here with no way to leave. An even cooler part about this Tentacool is you could soft reset for it to find a shiny. As for Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, did you know that these were bike racks, and you could interact with them to get on or off your bike? It doesn't serve too much of a purpose since you could just register your bike so you can ride it by just pressing select, but it's a cool little feature nonetheless. There's even a few secret wallpapers like this Team Galactic wallpaper for your PC that you can unlock with a special phrase depending on what your trainer's ID number is if you talk to this person in the Poketch building and say the correct phrases. Also in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, on certain days of the year you could see what looks like snow falling from the sky. It's called Diamond Dust and only appears on certain days like Junichi Masuda's birthday on January 12th, Pokemon Day on February 27th, and April 22nd, which is the day Diamond and Pearl released in North America and is also Earth Day, and I just checked my schedule and it's also supposed to be the day this video goes up. Similar Diamond Dust appears in Pokemon Black and White and Pokemon Black and White 2 as well on New Year's Eve. Now, while Team Rocket don't appear in the 5th generation, you could still find an ex-Team Rocket member in Unova. He lives in Icarus City and isn't wearing the signature Team Rocket Grunt uniform, but it's implied that the same guy is the same Team Rocket Grunt who robbed that one house in Cerulean City, and he moved to Unova to abandon his life of crime. In Black 2 and White 2, you can also find a former Team Aqua member and a former Team Magma member that are living together. The woman mentions how she was part of a group that wanted to cover the world in water, and the man says he was part of a group that wanted to make more land. They both say not to tell their partner their secrets, even though they're standing right next to you. Another couple you can find in Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 are Curtis and Yancey. You find their lost cross transceiver in Nimbasa City, and along the way Curtis, or Yancey depending on which character you're playing as, will call you periodically. After 10 calls, you can return the cross transceiver to them, but then they will just call you on your own cross transceiver. You get called if you're standing on a specific tile in the game, and in some of these calls they will offer to trade you Pokemon like Snorlax, Sableye, or Ralph that you can trade for any Pokemon that you have. There's 12 total Pokemon that can be traded to you from Curtis and Yancey, although unlocking all 12 is rather tedious, and I don't think many people out there ever got all 12 trades from them. Pokemon X and Y has an infamous item called the Strange Souvenir. It's given to you by an NPC in the hotel who hints that it's from another region far away. He doesn't say where it's from, but the item appears again in Pokemon Sun and Moon with an updated description saying, an ornament depicting a mysterious Pokemon that has been venerated as a guardian deity for an extremely long time in the Alola region, showing that even way back in X and Y, they already had some plans for Sun and Moon. While they did do a pretty good job for planning ahead for Sun and Moon with the Strange Souvenir, they didn't seem to plan ahead when they added AZ's Floette into Pokemon X and Y. AZ doesn't even use one of his own Floettes when you battle him, but AZ's Floette still exists in the game files as a Pokemon with different stats than regular Floette, can't evolve, and is unobtainable. This could suggest that it was originally planned for AZ to have one on his team when you battle him, or even for the player to be able to obtain one, but that was never the case. It even exists in the game files for future Pokemon games too, which could just be leftover data, but seeing as we never got to see the full story to Pokemon X and Y, I can't help but wonder if there was more in store planned for AZ's Floette. Then, in Anastar City, there is a man who asks you for a low-level Pokemon to keep him company. This seems rather innocent, but if you give him a Pokemon, then return to him after defeating the Elite Four, you will see a Pokeball containing the Pokemon on the ground, with a note implying that the man passed away. It's such a random and sad event that not too many people know about. Something similar happens in Generation 7 if you go to the Howali Cemetery in Alola at night in Sun and Moon. Here you can see a woman with her Machamp in front of a grave. She says how she comes here to pay respects to her husband who passed away while with his Machamp. The Machamp survived and now refuses to stay inside of its own Pokeball because it thinks it could have saved his trainer if it wasn't stuck in the Pokeball. On a much lighter note, there's a cool secret in Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee located on the docks near Vermilion City. You can actually find a truck here similar to the classic and iconic truck in the Generation 1 Pokemon games that appears off-screen next to the SS Anne. The truck spawned many rumors about Mew, when in reality it was just a random truck here, placed here for no real reason. And this truck in Let's Go is similar, as you wouldn't normally see it unless you go out of your way to find it, and it also serves no real purpose. It would have been neat if they let you catch Mew here or something, but instead, to get Mew in Let's Go, you have to buy this thing. For Generation 8, did you know that in Sword and Shield, the Joy-Cons in your room will match the Joy-Cons on your actual Switch that you're using to play Sword and Shield? This one seems pretty well known by now, but have you ever noticed that in Motostoke, the fire department has this funny logo with an artillery on it? You can also find this statue across the Galar region, which might look familiar to you since it's the same statue of Krogunk which appears on the counters of the Pokemart in Diamond and Pearl. You can find the same Krogunk statue in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and a lot of the secrets in these games are carried over from the original Diamond and Pearl game, except there were a few changes with some of the books in the Kanalave City Library. One book mentions how there was a Quillfish with huge spikes, which was a hint towards Hisuian Quillfish and its evolution Overquill, which has huge spikes. We of course got Legends Arceus released only a couple of months after Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and much like the Strange Souvenir, this was a nice little hint towards the next Pokemon game. Lance first appeared as the final Elite Four member in Pokemon Red and Blue before becoming the champion in Pokemon Gold and Silver, but did you know that Lance is actually from the Johto region, with his hometown being Blackthorn City, where his cousin Claire remains as the Dragon-type gym leader? When you rematch Lance in Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, you can easily take advantage of his team as they all have 4 times super effective weaknesses, making it pretty easy for what is supposed to be one of the most difficult fights in the game. Lance also has 2 Pokemon with moves they shouldn't normally have. His Dragonite knows Barrier in Red and Blue, and then in Gold and Silver his Aerodactyl has Rock Slide. Strangely, Aerodactyl couldn't learn Rock Slide until Generation 3. Much later, in 2016, there was an event for a Dragonite with Barrier released to people who played in the Kanto Classic Wi-Fi event for Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire to commemorate Lance's Barrier Dragonite. Lance also cheats in the Japanese versions of Pokemon Stadium 2, as his Feraligatr and Tyranitar are both holding the Quick Claw item, even though item clause is in the rule set and the player can't have repeat items on their team. This was fixed in international versions though, with Feraligatr holding a Mystic Water instead now. Technically, Lance isn't the first champion in Pokemon, as in Generation 1 your rival is the champion briefly and then you of course become the champion. But we'll save rivals and protagonists for a future video or something. For now, let's move on to Generation 3, which has two champions, starting with Steven Stone, who first appeared in Ruby and Sapphire. In the French versions of the game, Steven is named Pierre, which is also the same as Brock's name in French. Since Brock and Steven both appear in the Generation 3 anime, they just called Steven by his English name in the French dub of the anime, to avoid any confusion since him and Brock appear on screen at the same time some places. Now since Steven Stone and Brock both appear in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Brock is just called Pierre while Steven is called P. Rochard, which is his first initial and then his last name in French. Steven makes another mistake in Pokemon Emerald if you speak to him in Meteor Falls. He mentions the battle you helped him with in the Moss Deep City Space Center, but he says the Seutopolis City Space Center by mistake. This is even funnier when you realize that Steven's hometown is Moss Deep City, so he should know that the Space Center's in his hometown. Now, despite Generation 3 introducing double battles, this battle with Steven in the Space Center is the only time the player teams up with somebody for a double battle in Emerald version. Steven does have a similarity with Lance though, as although Steven is a Steel type specialist, he too often has Pokemon on his team that aren't even Steel type. At least Wallace, the other champion in Generation 3, does have a team full of Pokemon that fit his signature type in Water. He was a gym leader in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire before becoming the champion, and he is the only gym leader that gives out an HM for defeating him instead of a TM like every other gym leader does. The HM he gives out is Waterfall, so you can make it to the Elite Four. Wallace is also technically a Pokemon coordinator, something that is more fleshed out in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire with his cousin, Lycia. But even though Wallace is a coordinator, he doesn't nickname his Pokemon like every other coordinator does. Contest coordinators return in Generation 4 as well, but the champion in Diamond and Pearl isn't a coordinator, she's everyone's favorite champion, Cynthia. Many champions before her repeat types on her team or even have multiple Pokemon of the same species, but in Diamond and Pearl none of Cynthia's Pokemon types are shared with other team members, and her whole team consists of 11 unique types, with 12 being the maximum, making it one of the most diverse teams for any NPC to have. Cynthia also alludes to having another house outside of the Sinnoh region in Platinum version, implying that she is originally from another region. She of course can't live in both houses at the same time, since you can't be in two places at the same time, unless you count the Distortion World. In Platinum version, after completing all of the events of the Distortion World with Cynthia, you can use the portal to go back to the regular world to see Cynthia, but if you go back through the Distortion World again, you will still see Cynthia there until you talk to her again in the Overworld. It is fitting for Cynthia and Cyrus to have this conflict, as the English name for Cynthia is an epithet of the Greek goddess Artemis and is a poetic name for the moon, which parallels Cyrus's English name, which is often associated with the sun. Cynthia in the games is very interested in history and mythology, making her name even more fitting. Much like Generation 4, Generation 5 is rich with the region's history and mythology, starting with the two champions of this generation, Alder and Iris. Alder is an old man who somehow doesn't break his knees after making this jump, and he isn't known for using a single Pokemon type, although he does have 3 different bug-type Pokemon on his team. He also has Boufflant, and Boufflant is just cool, and he is the only champion to ever exclusively use Pokemon that were introduced in his same generation. You also don't have to battle Alder in the main story, since Team Plasma kind of messes that whole thing up, making Alder the only champion you don't have to fight to beat the main story. He's never returned in a future Pokemon game, so he's also never been seen using a Pokemon that wasn't from Gen 5, but he does have this Volcarona, which died. Well, not this exact Volcarona, but a past Volcarona that he had. This is a rare instance of a trainer talking about a Pokemon on their team that have died, and his Volcarona died due to a previous illness. This ties into the inspiration for his English name though, which is after the Alder moth. On a much lighter note, Alder can also be seen carrying more than 6 Pokeballs with Pokemon in them at a single time. This is because he could never figure out the PC storage system, which is just so fitting for an old man to not know how to use modern technology. Alder being old is even more seen in the Japanese versions of Pokemon Black and White, where he speaks in an old-fashioned Japanese dialect. As for Alder's counterpart champion, we have Iris, who is the Dragon-type specialist and the champion in Pokemon Black 2 and Pokemon White 2. She is the only champion to keep her Japanese name in English too, and although she is only a gym leader in Pokemon White and not the champion, her Haxorus has the ability Sheer Force in that game, despite not having any moves that can take advantage of the Sheer Force ability. Iris is also the only champion to not appear in the Pokemon World Tournament in Pokemon Black and White 2, probably because she's too busy being the actual champion in those games. Although she does have a Hydreigon on her team at level 53, despite Zweilios not evolving until level 64. When it comes to the anime, Iris travels with Ash as he journeys across the Unova region, and she is the first among Ash's friends to battle a champion as she battles Cynthia once, and she is the only one of Ash's friends to ever be a champion. For Generation 6 in Pokemon X and Y, we have another woman champion in Diantha. Diantha is also part of another trainer class called the Grand Duchess, which is a title that can only be given to the player if they play as Serena and go through the trainers in the Battle Chateau. She is also the only champion to not use Pokemon that are the same color. Now, in case you don't know, each Pokemon is assigned a different color category in the Pokedex, and in the case for Diantha's team, she has her green Hawlucha, red Tyrantrum, blue Aurorus, brown Gourgeist, purple Goodra, and white Gardevoir. And yes, I know some of these colors don't make that much sense, but they only give them one color. Diantha also didn't have her own card in the Pokemon trading card game until the Sun and Moon set Forbidden Light in 2018. I thought this was a bit weird since Steven, Iris, Cynthia, and a few other champions have had cards based on them that have came out in their respective generations, but then I realized that to this day, Alder has no signature card at all. Now, Generation 7 technically has no official champion, as Professor Kukui is a placeholder champion, since there was no Alolan champion yet, which is weird since in the strange souvenir item in Pokemon X and Y, an item that hints towards the Alola region, it mentions that region's champion, although in the events of Pokemon X and Y would have taken place before the events of Sun and Moon, meaning at that time there shouldn't have been a champion either. We could talk about Professor Kukui here since he is the closest thing to an Alola champion, but let's save that for a potential Professors video and move on to Leon, the champion of the Galar region. Leon's cape features all of his sponsors, including a Game Freak logo. He's also the first champion to give the player their starter Pokemon, and his name in Japanese is Dande after the first part of the word dandelion, with Leon coming from the later half of that word in English. So although it's not the same name, I appreciate the consistency and the inspiration for it. Galar does also feature some of the past region's champions in its DLC in Mustard and Peony. Mustard is the only NPC champion to use a legendary Pokemon in Urshifu, while Peony focuses on Steel-type Pokemon and is the only champion that doesn't have a full team of Pokemon at any point where you can battle him in the game. Sure, you don't ever have to fight these two champions to claim the title as champion in their games, but they are still technically champions. As for our most recent champion, we have Gita in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. She is the only champion alongside Alder, because Alder is just weird, that doesn't use a pseudo-legendary Pokemon or a starter Pokemon on her championship team. Her English name comes from the word Sagittaria, which is a plant that resembles Glimmora also, which is her ace Pokemon. Unfortunately, not much else is fleshed out for Gita, as we don't really hear much about her throughout the game or see much of her. First, we have Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. One would argue that the entire game's existence are a mistake because, well, have you ever played Red and Blue? But aside from the more well-known glitches and grammatical mistakes, my favorite mistake has to be the glitch that lets you bypass stone evolutions. Let's say you want to evolve your Staryu into Starmie and for whatever reason don't have access to a water stone. All you need to do to evolve it is get an Onix, then get into a battle leading with your Staryu that is close to leveling up. Switch into Onix, knock out a Pokemon to give Staryu enough EXP to level up, and Staryu will then evolve into Starmie. This happens because of an oversight with how data is stored, with Onix sharing some sort of value with the Water Stone that tricks the game into thinking that Staryu should evolve upon leveling up. This method works with any Pokemon that evolves with a Water Stone in Red and Blue, however you can also use it to bypass other stone evolutions with different Pokemon as you can see on your screen here. And yeah, for one of them you need Missing No, which is pretty funny. This stone bypassing error was fixed in Pokemon Yellow version along with many other glitches from Red and Blue, but Yellow version still has its fair share of mistakes. Like if you go to the Celadon City department store and talk to this one person on the 4th floor, he'll say that he's getting a Pokédoll to give to the copycat in Cerulean City. The copycat doesn't live in Cerulean City though, as they live in Saffron City. Also in Pokemon Yellow, your starter Pikachu famously follows you around because it doesn't like being in its Pokeball. Because of this, when you send out in battle and it's first in your party, it just runs across the screen as opposed to coming out of a Pokeball like any other Pokemon would. The issue with this is when you first get Pikachu and battle your rival, Pikachu is still in the Pokeball and doesn't yet break out of its Pokeball and follow you around, but that same animation for Pikachu running out into battle plays at the start of battle when it should be sent out of a Pokeball here. At least that mistake doesn't persist in Pokemon Gold and Silver, since Pokemon don't follow you around in those games, which is one positive to Pokemon not following you, I guess. They did, however, make a mistake with the moves Lock On and Mind Reader, which are similar moves that are intended to make the user's next attack hit the target Pokemon no matter what. Due to a programming oversight with how these moves work, if a target Pokemon is affected by Lock On or Mind Reader, then the other Pokemon goes for a move like Attract, Curse, Foresight, Transform, and a couple of other non-damaging moves, while the target Pokemon is in the first turn of Fly or Dig. The move coming from the Pokemon with Lock On or Mind Reader will not hit. Similarly, additional move effects like Bubble's chance to lower speed won't activate either even if the move hits. It just has a 0% chance to activate in those situations. Now, Pokemon Gold and Silver, and by association Crystal, are notorious for having weird level gaps between gyms and other key trainers and a region layout that can easily have you battle people out of order. You can even battle your rival out of order in one instance, where he is at 2 places at once. In Crystal, when you enter the Burn Tower for the first time, your rival doesn't immediately challenge you to a battle like they do in Gold and Silver, so you can hold off on battling him and go into Olivine City, where you will then see your rival walking out of Jasmine's gym and then talk to you. Then if you go back to the Burn Tower, your rival will still be there waiting for you to battle them, even though he should be gone by now. Surprisingly, for early released Pokemon games, the Generation 2 games as a whole don't really have that many glaring mistakes when it comes to grammar or typos, especially compared to the Generation 1 games. But then in Generation 3, we got some more spelling or grammar mistakes with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. The most famous example comes from Mawile's Pokedex entry, which has an H after the W in its name, which it isn't supposed to have. This was fixed in later releases of Ruby and Sapphire, but since it wasn't easy to patch games that didn't have online connectivity in the early 2000s, if you have a copy of Ruby and Sapphire that might have been right when the games released in 2003, you should check to see if yours has the correct or incorrect Mawile Pokedex entry. This one is also really subtle, but on Route 134, there is a tile of flowing water that you can walk on, and if you do it, it pushes you back to land, much like it would do if you were just surfing on it. Let's take a break from the Hoenn region for now and revisit Kanto with Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green version. There's a minor spelling mistake with the TJTV where the Pokedude will say Key Items Pocket, but the word pocket will have the K and the C switched around. Another funny error happens in these games when it comes to the listings of the Pokemon's categories in the Pokedex. If they have a category that's supposed to be 2 words, like how Pidgey is the tiny bird Pokemon, it would only display the first word, making Pidgey just the tiny Pokemon. Now back to Hoenn with Pokemon Emerald. Surprisingly, this and a few other glitches exist in Pokemon Emerald version that were not in Fire Red and Leaf Green or Ruby and Sapphire. Maybe in the future we can take a more in-depth look at Pokemon Emerald glitches, since surprisingly there's a lot of glitches exclusive to Emerald. But there is also a mistake with some of Steven's dialogue when he tried to battle him in the Meteor Falls in the post-game. He remembers the time you helped him in the Sootopolis City Space Center, although the Space Center isn't in Sootopolis City, it's in Mossdeep City. Now, the idea of space in the Pokemon world is expanded upon further in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, the first core series games on the Nintendo DS, which also have their fair share of mistakes, although some of these mistakes exist outside of the actual games themselves. Like in the North American manual for Pearl version, it says that you have to trade Pokemon to complete the Pokedex, although it says you have to trade with Pearl version to complete the Pokedex, which wouldn't work since Pearl version doesn't have the Diamond version exclusives and it's supposed to say trade with Diamond version. Then on the back cover of the Australian version for Diamond version, it says the Pokemon that ruins space in Diamond version, when Dialga, the Diamond version exclusive, is the Pokemon that ruins time, and Palkia, the Pearl version exclusive, ruins space. As for the actual games themselves, if you were to transfer a Pokemon from Fire Red or Leaf Green into Diamond and Pearl, there will be a small typo where it would put a space between the Fire and Red and then another space between the Leaf and the Green, when they are supposed to be one word without the space between it. This was later fixed in Platinum version, released about 2 years after Diamond and Pearl. In Platinum version though, they did mess up Black Belt Eddie's dialogue in the Victory Road. After defeating him, he is supposed to say "done in," but if you battle him in a double battle with the other nearby trainer, the text will just be all jumbled with the letters all over the place. For Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they allowed any Pokemon to follow you as opposed to just Pikachu like we saw back in Yellow version, as long as they weren't too big for the area and were first in your party. Because of this, if you enter the Cyanwood City gym with a Pokemon that is too big to follow you around and it stays inside of its Pokeball, then stand behind this waterfall here and switch your lead Pokemon to something that can follow you, the Pokemon will appear in a different part of the gym that it isn't supposed to be in. Moving on to Gen 5 with Pokemon Black and White, in the Chargestone Cave, if a dust cloud appears next to one of the blue rocks you can push and you interact with the rock, the dust cloud sprite will move on top of the player instead of being underneath the player like it's supposed to be. There's also a few instances where if you're surfing and find an NPC standing right next to the edge of the water, you can sometimes glitch onto the NPC when you go onto land and stand in the same tile that they're standing on. For their sequels, Pokemon Black 2 and Pokemon White 2, there is a minor grammatical error in the gate between Nimbasa City and Route 16 where an NPC will say, 2 years ago, a Pokemon called Zoroark was hiding in its lair in the Lost Lorn Forest on Route 16, where the word "its" has an apostrophe between the T and the S when it shouldn't, as when you put an apostrophe in the word "it's," it's supposed to mean "it is," which doesn't make sense for this sentence. In Pokemon X and Y, if you walk past any sign, your player's head will turn to look at the sign even if you are walking parallel to the sign, which allows you to interact and read the signs without directly facing them. Kind of a minor but nice quality of life feature in Pokemon X and Y. For some reason though, this just doesn't work with the sign in front of the daycare center on Route 7, and you can only read it if you're directly facing it. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire also have a strange mistake, but this time with the promotional material used when advertising the game. They release an image of Mega Blaziken using Ice Punch on a Flygon, but Blaziken can't learn Ice Punch. Also in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, some Pokemon, like Wailmer and Sharpedo, have unique surfing models that if they're used to surf. If you happen to be surfing on your Wailmer though, use your fishing rod, battle a Pokemon so that your Wailmer then evolves into Wailord. The game will freeze when the battle ends because the game is trying to change from Wailmer's surfing model into the default generic model that Pokemon would have, which confuses the game. There's another glitch involving evolution in Pokemon Sun and Moon, where sometimes when a Pokemon is evolving on the screen, you can see a transparent version of the Pokemon it's trying to evolve into right next to it. Then in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, the last main series games for the 3DS, if you go to Coney City, you'll notice some NPCs are actually dittos like this chef in the restaurant. If you happen to stand slightly to the right of this ditto, then talk to the ditto chef, this will start a battle. Then if you defeat the ditto in battle or catch the imposter chef ditto, the imposter chef will disappear and then the real chef will rush in to try to go to his spot to work. However, since you're in the real chef's way, he will just keep walking into you for about 30 seconds and then stop. Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee also have some NPCs who do weird things. Like if you battle your rival in the SS Anne and they use a full restore to heal one of their Pokemon, the game will say, you used a full restore, even though you didn't use your full restore and your rival did instead, and should say your rival's name used a full restore. Now you may have noticed that as time went on, it seems like there were less and less mistakes in each Pokemon game, which is true to an extent, although Pokemon Sword and Shield have a few more mistakes than some of the last couple of Pokemon games did. Some of these mistakes have been patched out or were only available in the game for a short amount of time, which was the case with a Drillbur event. Back in April of 2020, some event Drillbur raids on Shield version would come with a Drillbur that knows Hydro Pump. This was later fixed in that same event since Drillbur shouldn't have Hydro Pump and was only active for a couple hours. There's another oversight in Sword and Shield with the move Trick Room, although similar oversights existed in previous games as well. Basically, if a Pokemon on your team had an effective speed set of over 1809, which can be achieved by having a naturally fast Pokemon boost its speed with an attack like Agility, it will just ignore the Trick Room and attack first anyway because of an overflow oversight with the speed value and how it's calculated under Trick Room. I could go on a bit more with Pokemon Sword and Shield like I can with Red and Blue or Emerald version, but let's just move on to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl for now. Some people out there might say that these games' existence alone are a mistake, although much like with Pokemon Sword and Shield, a lot of the mistakes were patched out like this glitch sticker you can get in the Jubilife TV station. This person would give you a random sticker for your ball capsules, and there was a small chance you could get a glitched unnamed capsule, resulting in the text just saying, you received 1. There was also this funny glitch where you could battle the 7th gym leader, whose name I'm forgetting, without actually doing the gym puzzle, due to a glitch that lets you slide up this ice ledge diagonally. It was a pretty cool trick for speedruns, and a result of the game allowing you to move diagonally, which you couldn't do in the original Diamond and Pearl games. This next one can also happen in Pokemon Sword and Shield, but if you name a Pokemon Egg with a capital E then 2 lowercase g's, and deposit in the PC, then interact with the Pokemon named Egg, the game will think it's an actual egg and ask you what you want to do with the egg, where if you nickname your Pokemon anything else or just don't nickname it at all, it will cut out the word the and just use the Pokemon's name, since asking what you want to do with the Psyduck just doesn't make a lot of sense now. Pokemon Legends Arceus, on the other hand, didn't have PCs because it takes place before they were ever invented, but it does have a glitch where sometimes in battle, it will display all of your moves as being normal type moves, even though they aren't actually normal type moves. There was also a glitch that is now patched, but I thought was pretty funny, but in version 1.0 of Legends Arceus, if a wild Cherrim changes forms, it just wouldn't be possible to catch it. Dragon-type Pokemon are among one of the most popular Pokemon types, and the fact that all but 2 pseudo-legendary Pokemon are Dragon-type probably has something to do with that. Of these pseudo-legendary Dragon types, Garchomp is the only one to not have a gender difference between both of its forms, and Goodra is the only one that isn't a dual-type Pokemon, although of course Hisuian Goodra is part Steel-type and makes up the only regional form for a pseudo-legendary Pokemon. As for regular Dragon-type Pokemon, Dragon-types have been paired with every other type in the game with the exception of Bug-type. We still don't have a single Bug and Dragon type Pokemon, although there have been some good potential candidates in the past like Yanmega or Flygon. We did get kind of close to having a Mega Flygon in Generation 6, which could have been part Bug type. However, one other interesting thing about Generation 6 is that it was the only generation to not introduce any new Dragon type moves, which is unusual for a generation to just not have moves of a certain type. There's also only 2 non-damaging Dragon type moves in the game in Dragon Dance, which increases your attack and speed, and Clangoria's Soul, which is Komo-O's signature move, so most Dragon type Pokemon only have access to 1 non-damaging Dragon type move. There are, however, 29 Dragon type moves, making up only about 3% of the total Pokemon moves, making Dragon moves the least common type of moves out there. It is a shame because Dragon type moves are all pretty cool, and by that I mean in Generation 3, all of the Dragon type moves used in Pokemon contests were categorized as cool moves. Luckily by Generation 3, there was a few Dragon moves to choose from, as back in Generation 1, the only Dragon type move that did any damage in the game was Dragon Rage. Dragon Rage is a move that always does 40 damage no matter what, meaning it wouldn't give the user a same stat attack bonus and also would never do super effective damage. On top of having only the one offensive Dragon move, the only Dragon type Pokemon in Generation 1 was the Dragonite evolutionary line, which is one reason why making Lance a Dragon type expert in Generation 1 is weird, but then in Generation 2 they again only added one new Dragon type Pokemon in Kingdra, introduced another signature Dragon type trainer in Claire, who is the 8th gym leader, who also only has one Dragon-type Pokemon on her team in Kingdra, and then they also kept Lance as the champion, but didn't give him a Kingdra on his team, and instead just gave him 3 Dragonites and called him the Dragon Expert. Kingdra does evolve from Seadra, a Generation 1 Pokemon, which then evolves from Horsea, while Horsea and Seadra are also technically considered Dragon-type Pokemon, as their Pokemon category is the Dragon Pokemon, which would mean that these 2 Pokemon are the only non-Dragon-type Pokemon to be Dragon Pokemon. At least Dragon-type experts in future games would feature teams that would actually have Dragon-type Pokemon, like Ryuki's team in Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon. A trainer that people tend to forget about, but he does have a really cool outfit on. They also didn't introduce a Dragon-type specialist in Generation 4, which was the only time they've ever done that, as although Cynthia has a Dragon-type Pokemon on her team in Garchomp, which is also her ace Pokemon, she is not considered to be a Dragon-type expert. Every single Dragon-type expert appears later on in the game too, with many of them being Elite 4 members or just one of the last 2 gym leaders. This makes sense since Dragon-type Pokemon usually aren't available until pretty late on in the game, or in the case for Pokemon like Dragonair, they don't evolve until a very high level. Some non-Dragon-type trainers even have some pretty powerful Dragon types, like how in the Pokemon World Tournament in Pokemon Black and White 2, Fantina could have a Giratina on her team. It is part Ghost type, which makes sense because she is a Ghost type trainer after all. However, Fantina actually uses Origin form Giratina here, even though it isn't holding the Greasiosaur, which is needed to make Giratina turn into its Origin form. It's holding a Ghost Gem instead, and on top of that you can also battle Winona here, who has a Rayquaza. Something about these gym leaders having the third legendary Pokemon in their respective regions is just really cool. Also in Generation 5, you can catch a Dino. Unfortunately, you can't get one until the Victory Road, but its final form, Hydreigon, evolves level 64, which is the latest level that any Pokemon evolves in the game. When it comes to purity, there are only 13 pure Dragon-type Pokemon in the game, with the only fully evolved full Dragon types coming from Generations 5 and Generation 6. For Dragon-type Pokemon as a whole, there are 70 total Dragon types, making up 6.9% of total Pokemon, tying it with Fairy, coincidentally, as the second least common Pokemon type, with Galar introducing the most amount of Dragon types in a region with 11 new Dragon type Pokemon in Sword and Shield. While Dragon type Pokemon are often seen for their sheer offense with powerhouses like Roaring Moon, Dialga, or Rayquaza, Dragon type Pokemon actually have the highest HP stat on average, along with the highest special attack stat on average. They also have the most unique held items that boost Dragon type moves directly, which is something I never really thought about, but that does include items like the Dragon Gem, which aren't around anymore, and items that only work for specific Dragon type Pokemon like the Soldew does for Latios and Latias, consisting of 10 total items. Being that Dragon is only super effective against other Dragon type Pokemon, it's the only type that can never dish out a 4x super effective move, as there's no dual type Pokemon that just has the same type twice. And on the topic of taking damage, Mega Altaria is the only Dragon type Pokemon that is immune to Dragon due to its part Fairy typing. It's a shame that Mega Pokemon are gone though, since type combinations like Dragon and Fairy don't currently exist elsewhere. But one cool fact about Mega Evolution is that Dragon type is the most common type gain for a Mega Pokemon upon Mega Evolution, as Mega Charizard X, Mega Ampharos, and Mega Sceptile are 3 Pokemon that gain the Dragon typing upon Mega Evolution. Now for some Dragon-type Pokemon records, Eternatus is the tallest and heaviest Dragon-type Pokemon, standing at a whopping 65 feet 7 inches tall and weighing a measly 2,094.4 pounds. Eternatus Eternamax form has the highest base stat total for any Dragon-type Pokemon at 1,125 base stat, which compared to a Pokemon like Garchomp, Garchomp only has 600. Gumi is the smallest Dragon-type Pokemon, standing at exactly 1 foot tall, while Applin is the lightest, weighing only 1.1 pounds. When it comes to the Pokemon trading card game, Dragon-type has always been pretty unique. For balancing issues, the trading card game doesn't incorporate every single type that the game incorporates and matches up some Pokemon types into other types, like how most rock and ground type Pokemon are just considered to be fighting type Pokemon, or how currently poison type Pokemon are just dark types. Up until 2012, there was no official type for Dragon in the trading card game, with many Dragon type Pokemon just being represented as colorless or normal type. They then introduced a proper Dragon typing into the trading card game with their own symbol as well, but there is still no basic Dragon type energy, making it the only type in the Pokemon trading card game to just not have a basic energy. The Dragon typing symbol in the trading card game is also this yellowish orange, which isn't consistent with its type colors in the video games. Although to be fair, Dragon's type colors in the game have never really been consistent compared to other types in the game. In Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, Dragon typing was represented by this deep purple color, then in Fire Red and Leaf Green through Generation 4, Dragon typing was listed as having this blue and red color. It then went back to this darker purple for Generations 5, 6, and 7, then in Generation 8 turned into more of a bluish color and is now currently a paler purple in Scarlet and Violet compared to the original purple we first saw in Ruby and Sapphire. Then in side series Pokemon games and spin-off games, they are sometimes represented the same way as they are in the main series games, like how they are in Pokemon Go or in the new Pokemon Snap game for the Switch. But then in Pokemon Stadium 2, the dragon icon is just a green D, and in Rescue Team DX as well as some Japanese exclusive arcade games, the dragon typing logo is a yellow or gold color, more similar to how it is in the trading card game. Then there's Pokemon Ranger, which just looks like this pixel art of the Jurassic Park logo, and I don't really know what they were going for with this one. If you were to compare the Dragon type logos to another type like Psychic, Psychic is a lot more consistent across main series and spin-off games, as they're all just pink with slightly different shades. In terms of main series games, it's also pretty common to see a Dragon type Pokemon on the cover of a Pokemon game, like how Reshiram and Zekrom are on the cover for Pokemon Black and White. Reshiram and Zekrom were even featured in the 2010 Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in New York City alongside Pikachu, which took place about 4 months before Pokemon Black and White released in North America. A Dragon-type legendary Pokemon that doesn't appear on the cover of a game, but probably should, is Zygarde. Zygarde didn't really get that much attention in Pokemon X and Y, or even in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and instead just had most of its story just slapped into Pokemon Sun and Moon as more of a side quest, if anything. In the manga for Pokemon Sun and Moon though, Zygarde Complete Form plays a bigger role in the story and even helps fight against Necrozma. A showdown between these two Pokemon just sounds like it'd be really cool, and it's a shame we never saw it in the games. The names for Pokemon in Spanish are the same as their English counterparts, which can cause some confusion, which was the case for Dialga when they were releasing Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. In Spanish, the word alga at the end of Dialga's name means algae, so the Spanish translation team for Pokemon suggested that they rename Dialga because it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for this Pokemon to have algae in its name, but they just kept it anyway. Did you know that in Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, you can watch a couple of Pikachus get married? All you need to do is visit the Hano Grand Hotel and talk to this trainer. If you say yes, you then get to watch these two Pikachus walk down the aisle together, face each other, then the screen goes dark and they run off. You get a rose incense for watching this as a wedding favor, then you never see them again. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon have so many of these weird little side events and cutscenes that don't serve much of a purpose. In fact, there's over 150 events like this in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon alone, most of which you probably don't even know about, like this other event where you can have dinner with Olivia in Coney City. I'm sure someone out there would love for that to be a reality, and Olivia will even end up paying for the meal and give you 4 heart scales for eating with her. You know how in the original Red and Blue games you couldn't get any Pokemon eggs? They remedied this in the remakes Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, where in the post game you have access to a daycare center to breed eggs. But did you know that there's also this random rich guy in the water labyrinth near 5 Island on the Sevi Islands that gives you a Togepi egg? I didn't even know about this egg until recently. In fact, most of the stuff in this video that I'm talking about I didn't even know until this year. So if someone out there knows all of the facts in this video before watching this video, I will be quite surprised. Either way, if you know all of these facts or not, you should totally subscribe. As for this Togepi egg, it's a cool little way to get Togepi, but you get it so late in the game that you can't even use Togepi while playing through the actual game. Random gift Pokemon like this are my favorite, like how in the battle resorts of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, you could find a couple where one of them was part of Team Magma and the other was part of Team Aqua. They will give you a camera up and a Sharpedo that they raise while they're with their respective teams. Although since this is also in the post game, you can't really do much with these Pokemon outside of using them to fill your Pokedex if you haven't caught them already. While that might seem a little out of place and random, nothing is more out of place than Crasher Wake. Well, he's not really out of place in the Sinnoh region, but he randomly appears in Heart Gold and Soul Silver and gives you a mask of a Sinnoh starter Pokemon in the Celadon City department store. He also appears on Route 47 right before the Safari Zone, but you probably knew about that one already. But did you know that Crasher Wake also appears in Pokemon Black 2 and White 2? In a part of Route 18 that you don't even have to go to, you can find Crasher Wake just standing there and staring out into the water. He's singing a song about himself, and after he notices you, he'll ask, "Do you know what the wake is singing?" which has to be a reference to the rock, and ask you if you know about his gym in the Sinnoh region. He then reveals that although his backstory says how he was raised abroad and then came to Sinnoh at an older age, he was actually born and raised in Sinnoh. He then runs off and never returns here. I don't even know why he was even here in the first place. That's not the only weird event in Unova though, as in Black and White 1, even though the main game only features the new Unovan Pokemon, in the post game there is a Magikarp salesman on the Marvelous Bridge. Now, if you've been on this channel for a while, you will know that I am a big advocate for the Magikarp salesman, and the one in Unova is even guaranteed to have perfect speed IVs when you buy it, to make it even more worth it than it already is. Pokemon X and Y have a lot of these weird events too, some of which are well known like the Ghost Girl, but there is another weird event involving a ghost. On Thursdays, you have a chance of finding Banette hiding in the trash cans of the Pokemon Village. I don't know why they chose Banette for this and not Garbodor or Muck or something that would belong in the trash, but this is the only way to catch Banette in Pokemon X and Y, even though it also received a Mega Evolution in the same games. Now maybe if Banette is one of your favorite Pokemon and you caught it back in X and Y, you would know about that one. And maybe if you love ribbons, you'd know about the Shock Ribbon. The Shock Ribbon is a ribbon for recalling a thrilling event that made life more exciting. Now I have no idea what that really means, but in Pokemon Platinum, you can get this ribbon from Julia in Sunnyshore's City, but only on Tuesdays. She actually gives out a different ribbon on every single day of the week if you didn't know. And now that we're getting into these daily events, things get a bit more weird. One of the more specific examples of this comes in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. After collecting all 16 gym badges in Johto and Kanto, you can see Erica in front of the fountain on Sundays between 2 PM and 4:59 PM in Celadon City. She doesn't battle you or give you anything, but she lets you register her in her Pokegear. Also in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, as well as Gold, Silver, and Crystal version, we have the weak siblings, 7 of them to be exact, and every day they will give you a different item, and in Heart Gold and Soul Silver they can also give you a special ribbon. They appear in various areas throughout the Johto region and give out some decent items, like Monica on Route 40 gives you a Sharpeak on Mondays, or Sunny on Route 37 who gives you a magnet on Sundays. That's enough about days of the week for now. Let's take a break and talk about starter Pokemon, something that everybody loves. Prior to being able to trade online, obtaining some of these starter Pokemon was quite a hassle if you wanted to complete your Pokedex, especially when it comes to obtaining the Generation 2 starters during the Generation 3 era. Sure, you could have just played Pokemon Coliseum and transfer over one of the Johto starters into Ruby and Sapphire if you happen to have one of those fancy cables that nobody ever has, but in Emerald version, upon completing the Hoenn Pokedex, you can talk to the professor and get your choice of one of the 3 Johto starter Pokemon at level 5. Heart Gold and Soul Silver take this a step further, as after defeating Red, you can talk to Professor Oak and receive a Kanto starter Pokemon of your choice also at level 5. Then after doing that, you can also meet Steven in the Silphco, who will give you your choice of a Hoenn starter Pokemon. Compared to getting a Generation 2 starter Pokemon in a Generation 3 game, these aren't as hard to obtain, especially with Pal Park, but it's a nice bonus reward for beating one of the hardest trainers in all of Pokemon. This next one you have to go quite out of your way to do, but it's also in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which is a popular game for this video. After defeating Claire, if you go to the Dragon's Den and talk to the elders, then leave by using the escape rope or the dig TM, you will bypass the cutscene where Claire stops you and gives you the Dragon Breath TM. If you do this, she will later appear in her gym, and if you talk to her, she will give you the TM, but this time her text will be a bit different, and instead of apologizing to you and giving you the TM like she would in the Dragon's Den, she will note how you made her hold on to the TM and kept her waiting until you came back to her gym to get it. While you did have to go quite out of your way to do that last one, this next one requires you to have an extra piece of hardware just to see some special events. In Mossdeep City, you might have noticed this locked secret door in the old man's house in Ruby and Sapphire. This door spawned many urban legends back in the day, from this door hiding a legendary Pokemon, to this door leading to a spaceship to take you to outer space to catch Deoxys, which wouldn't make a lot of sense because the Space Center is right around the corner. But in order to actually open this door, you need the e-reader, which was a device for the Game Boy Advance that had some cards you could then scan to unlock a few things in certain games. In the case of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, you could connect up your copy of Ruby and Sapphire to another Game Boy Advance with the e-reader, go to the mystery gift option, and scan the e-reader card on the other Game Boy, then later go through the door in Mossdeep City to battle a special trainer that correlates to the card you scanned. This is incredibly tedious and convoluted to set up, and yes, I went through the trouble of doing it just to crudely record this video, but this was still a nice cool little bonus feature, and some of these battles would even give you some special items like special berries that you can't even obtain elsewhere. Pokemon Gold and Silver introduced Apricorns, which could then be given to Kurt to turn into special Pokeballs. These Pokeballs are among some favorites among fans, but can be difficult to obtain in newer games. Some of these include the Friend Ball, which make Pokemon caught more friendly towards you, the Heavy Ball, which works better on heavier Pokemon, and the Moon Ball, which they messed up pretty bad. All of these Pokeballs I just mentioned have some sort of mistake associated with them, with the strangest being the Moon Ball. If you had to guess what added effect the Moon Ball had when you caught a Pokemon, you might guess that it gives you a better chance to catch a Pokemon at night, a better catch rate for Pokemon that evolve with the Moonstone, or maybe even a better catch rate against Dark types which were new to Gold and Silver. But you probably wouldn't have guessed that in Pokemon Gold and Silver, the added effect the Moon Ball has is actually an increased catch rate for Pokemon that evolve with a Burn Heal. And yeah, you heard me right, Pokemon that evolve with a Burn Heal. Since no Pokemon evolve with a Burn Heal, this is rather useless, although they did intend for the Moon Ball to have an increased catch rate for Pokemon that evolve with the Moonstone, like Clefairy, which would have made a lot more sense. They just accidentally referenced the index number for the Moonstone that it was in the Generation 1 Pokemon games instead of what it was in the Generation 2 Pokemon games, and it just so happens that that same index number in Generation 2 is for a Burn Heal. As for the Friend Ball, they accidentally called it the Stun Ball in a Kids WB promo. Not even close with that one, I just thought it was pretty funny. For the heavy ball, things get a bit more complicated, as in Pokemon Sun and Moon, the heavy ball will always fail if used on a Pokemon that weighs under 100 kilograms and has a catch rate of 20 or less. In fact, it's actually a negative catch rate in those situations. This was never intended, and as a result in Pokemon Sun and Moon, it's impossible to catch a Beldum or any of the Tapus in a heavy ball. Another impossible situation in Pokemon would be Spiritomb or Sableye having the ability Wonder Guard in Generation 4. This is probably why these Pokemon never got these abilities officially, as they would be immune to every single type that existed at the time, and Wonder Guard makes it so you can only be hit by moves which are super effective. But there is one oversight with this ability. The move Fire Fang will still work on a Pokemon that has the Wonder Guard ability, but since the only Pokemon that actually gets the Wonder Guard ability is Shedinja, a Bug-type Pokemon which is weak to fire anyway, this mistake can easily go unnoticed and isn't really much of an issue. And the reason why this happens is because of a typo with Fire Fang that lets it bypass the super effective check for the Wonder Guard ability. Wonder Guard isn't the only ability in Generation 4 that has a weird mistake associated with it though, as the ability Suction Cups is supposed to have an out-of-battle effect that makes it so if a Pokemon with that ability is in the lead, your fishing rods are more likely to get bites. This just doesn't work in Diamond and Pearl though, and strangely, it also just doesn't work in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl either, but it has worked in every core series game released between them, aside from Let's Go of course, which just doesn't have abilities. The Let's Go games have a different mistake involving Hiker Gym's Onix located in the Underground Path. He's a master trainer, and his level 70 Onix knows the move Wrap, a move that Onix doesn't normally learn. This was probably meant to be Bind instead, a very similar move that Onix does learn. There are quite a few instances of Pokemon knowing moves they shouldn't in Pokemon games, and we've talked about quite a few of them in the past, but we've never discussed Gardevoir having Fairy Wind when it isn't supposed to. In pre-release footage for Pokemon X and Y, we can see a Gardevoir going for Fairy Wind on a Hydreigon to show off the Fairy typing, which was new at that time, and despite Fairy Wind being outclassed by better Fairy type moves that Gardevoir does have access to, like Dazzling Gleam or Moonblast, it cannot learn the weaker Fairy Wind attack in Pokemon X and Y. At least they called Fairy Wind by its right name though, unlike Bugsy in Pokemon Stadium 2. He has a Heracross with the move Megahorn in the game, but he calls Megahorn Megaphone instead, which would make for a good sound-based move, but doesn't actually fit for Heracross. Also in Pokemon Stadium 2, at least in the non-Japanese versions, if you were to connect up a non-Japanese copy of Pokemon Blue version to show the map locations for Pokemon, it will incorrectly show the locations for Pokemon that were actually in the Japanese version of Blue version instead, which have different locations than the non-Japanese versions. When it comes to the Nintendo GameCube, the closest thing we have to Pokemon Stadium on it was Pokemon Colosseum, which had its own RPG-like story in addition to a battle mode. The game has a funny mistake where the move Frenzy Plant is called Solid Plant by accident. This could be a mistranslation since the Japanese name for Frenzy Plant is Hard Plants, but the move is correctly called Frenzy Plant in the Generation 3 games Ruby and Sapphire. Now for Pokemon Legends Arceus. You can obtain Giratina Origin Form in the game, but the one you catch is Shiny Locked. If you were to transfer over a Shiny Giratina Origin Form to Legends Arceus though from a different game, then go for Shadow Force in a battle, the game will just crash for an unknown reason. This still hasn't been patched out as of me making this video, and non-Shiny Giratinas can still go for Origin Pulse without crashing your game just fine. You could also be making a mistake yourself by not clicking that like and subscribe button too. I don't plug that too often, and I notice that when I do, a lot more people tend to like and subscribe, and I'd like to hit 200k subscribers pretty soon. For Pokemon X and Y, as well as any game with a bike, the music will change to the bike theme when riding the bike. That's not the case for if you get on your bike in Lumio City though, since the regular town theme will still play while riding a bike. Following Pokemon X and Y, we went to Alola with Pokemon Sun and Moon, and then we went to Alola again with Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. In a trailer for Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, there is a Naganadel that is being sent out from a Beast Ball. However, in those games, it's impossible to get a Naganadel in a Beast Ball. You originally obtain its pre-evolution Poipole in a regular Pokeball and can't catch any more of it. The Poipole you get is also genderless, meaning you can't breed it either, but in Pokemon Emerald, some gym trainers have Pokemon that are male and female depending on when you battle them. When you first battle Roxanne, Flannery, and Winona, all of their Pokemon are female, but when you rematch them later on in the game, all their Pokemon will just be male at a higher level. This next one is a bit more well known, but I don't think I can make 2 videos about mistakes in Pokemon without mentioning this. It comes from everyone's favorite Pokemon game, Pokemon Sword and Shield. In the end credits, you can just barely see a mouse cursor floating around, and it's hard to notice if you don't know it's there, but since learning about this mistake, I now notice it every time I beat Sword and Shield, which was like 4 times. Sword and Shield did introduce cool Galarian forms like Slowpoke, which has a mistake dating back all the way to the beginning of Pokemon. Slowpoke sometimes used to be shown with this striped pattern on its belly, and sometimes it's just not shown with this pattern. In the Japanese version of Gold and Silver, you can clearly see this pattern on its belly and its sprite, but then in the international versions of Gold and Silver, this was removed, and the sprite just has a bare pink belly. There is some Generation 1 artwork made by Ken Sugimori that shows Slowpoke with this pattern. However, since Slowbro, its evolution, also has this pattern on its belly, it's possible just a mistake and they got Slowpoke and Slowbro confused. Slowpoke debuted all the way back in Generation 1, and a well-known mistake in the Generation 1 Pokemon games that has spawned many theories is this NPC in Red and Blue who asks you to trade him a Raichu for his Electrode. If you do, he claims that the Raichu evolved, because in the Japanese versions he asks you for a Kadabra, which does evolve when being traded. And they never change the text when translating the game to other languages. Another similar instance happens in Cerulean City 2 if you trade a Poliwhirl for a Jinx. The man will claim that the Poliwhirl went and evolved right after the trade, but Poliwhirl only evolves with a Water Stone in Red and Blue and not through trade. In the Japanese versions, this man actually asks for a Machoke in exchange for a Haunter, both of which do evolve when being traded. There is also, of course, the infamous NPC in Snowpoint City in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, who trades you a Haunter that's holding an Everstone for a Medicham. Since the Haunter's holding an Everstone, it means it won't evolve into Gengar when being traded, which is pretty annoying. You can get revenge in Pokemon Crystal though by trading a Haunter with an Everstone for Chris's Xatu. If you do this, he will still say that the Haunter evolved after trading it to him, which it shouldn't have since it had an Everstone all along. This is the brick piece. Well, actually, this is just a regular brick, but in Generation 2, they introduced this item and never gave it an actual sprite. The brick piece can be obtained via trading a Machop from a Generation 1 Pokemon game into a Generation 2 game, as when you do that, some Pokemon are just given a held item. The brick piece has no real functionality outside of being sold. In Gold and Silver, it has the description of a rare chunk of brick. Then in Crystal, the word brick is replaced with tile. So this is just another rare item you can sell like the pearl or the nugget, right? Well, not exactly, because even though it's described as being rare, it only sells for 25 Pokédollars and never appeared in another main series game since Crystal. Other Generation 1 Pokemon will hold items when transferred over into Generation 2, with most of them just having a berry. Venomoth will hold an item called the Gold Leaf, which has no use but sells for 1,000 Pokédollars, which isn't nearly as bad as the brick piece. Rapidash will hold the Silver Leaf, which sells for only 500, and you can even get some TMs randomly, like TM43 Detect, by transferring over either of the Nidorans, but my favorite has to be the brick piece. This is all pretty useless, especially in case of the brick piece, but it only scratches the surface when it comes to the amount of useless facts there are in Pokemon. Like, look at Hilbert for example, the main protagonist from Pokemon Black and White. Did you know that his hat viewed from above looks like a Pokeball? This information is rather useless, not sure what you're gonna do with this, but if you didn't know it before, now you do. Now when it comes to the mainline Pokemon games, the protagonists aren't the only ones that have useless facts, as there's some random NPCs that have some too. Like in Pokemon X and Y, you ever noticed how the schoolboy and schoolgirl NPCs are just younger versions of the scientists? Or how the two veteran trainers are just older versions of the Pokemon Ranger classes? I'm not sure if they're related or if this is some sort of time travel shenanigans or if it's just a coincidence, but they still do seem very similar. Did you know that the fire-type gym leader Kabu from Sword and Shield is originally from Hoenn? I didn't know that until recently, and it might be one of the more well-known facts in this video, but I just found out and thought it was neat. Another thing that's cool in Pokemon is Melton. It kind of just appeared out of nowhere a few years ago, was dropped in Pokemon Go, then made its way to the core series games later on. But did you know that when Melton evolves into Melmetal in the main series games, it's supposed to have the move Thunder Punch when evolving? The problem with this is impossible to do, since in the main series games you can't evolve Melton into Melmetal. It can only do that in Pokemon Go, so it just can't learn Thunder Punch that way. Take a look at this. This is Bulbasaur C, shaped like Bulbasaur, hence the name, Bulbasaur C. It appears in Pokemon Rumble Rush, an entry in the Pokemon Rumble series for mobile devices. there is a chance you might not even known this game existed, as by the time it released worldwide it was July 2019, and then in July of 2020 the game was shut down, so you can't even play it anymore and can't visit the Bulbasaur Sea. EV training is a common practice in Pokemon that I'm not going to get too in depth with in this video, but to give a brief explanation in case you don't know how it works, basically knocking out a certain Pokemon will give an extra stat boost in different stats upon leveling up. Typically the EVs a Pokemon give will be among one of their best stats, like Magikarp giving a speed EVs for example. For some reason though, Yanmega yields 2 attack EVs when knocked out, despite its attack stat being one of its lowest stats. Now you probably won't encounter too many Yanmegas, if any, if you were EV training in a modern Pokemon game, but it is weird how it gives EVs in a stat that's useless for itself. In the Super Smash Bros. Games, one of the items that can be used is a Pokeball. It sends out a random Pokemon that helps you fight, but originally in the first Smash game on the N64, Mewtwo was originally planned to appear as a Pokeball Pokemon too before being cut. Then Mewtwo was added in the next game, Super Smash Bros. Melee, as an actual fighter. Cramorant is an interesting Pokemon with its Gulping form and its Gorging form. It's eating an Arrokuda and a Pikachu respectively in each form. However, neither of the Pokemon it has in its mouth can ever be shiny, and the Pikachu is always a male Pikachu, which can be seen by the shape of its tail. Every TM is assigned a number, and sometimes that number changes in different generations, like Thunderwave being TM45 in Generation 1, but then TM73 in Generation 7. There are some consequences though to changing the numbers of TMs between generations, as the only reason why Pokemon like Beheeyem and Levani can learn Steel Wing is because of these changes. Despite both of these Pokemon not having any wings, they can learn Steel Wing. This is because TM51 was Ally Switch, a move that makes a lot of sense for both of these Pokemon to learn, as many Pokemon can learn those moves. But then it was changed to Steel Wing and they just forgot to make the internal changes to reflect that and just left it, so now your Beheeyem can just go for Steel Wing.